I watched the first tear hit the mahogany surface of our dining table, and all I could think about was the math. That single shimmering drop of salt water was supposed to be a sign of remorse, a symbol of a woman shattered by her own mistakes. But to me it looked like a calculated investment. In that moment, watching Raina's shoulders heave with practiced sobs, I realized that her performance wasn't just a plea for my heart, it was a play for my silence. And every second I sat there pretending to be the broken, grieving husband who was ready to fold, I was actually calculating the cost of her betrayal down to the last cent. That tear didn't mean she loved me. It meant she thought she still had me under her thumb. And that was her first mistake. Before we go any further into the wreckage of what used to be my life, I have to ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room with someone you've shared a bed with for years? Someone who knows your favorite coffee order and your deepest fears and realized you were looking at a complete stranger? Have you ever had to play the fool just to see how far a person would go to destroy you? If you've ever been the person everyone pitied while you were secretly holding all the cards, drop a yes in the comments. I need to know there are others out there who understand the power of a silent countermove. And hey, let me know where you're watching from tonight, whether you're in a quiet suburb or a loud city. Betrayal feels the same everywhere. Don't forget to subscribe because this isn't just a story about a failing marriage, it's a blueprint for a quiet revolution. We lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Seattle. You know, the kind manicured lawns, neighbors who wave but don't ask too many questions, and the constant soft gray of the Pacific Northwest sky. I'm a structural engineer by trade. My entire life is built on the concept of integrity. If the foundation is off by even a fraction of an inch, the whole building is eventually coming down. I apply that same logic to everything. For 7 years, I thought our foundation was solid. Raina was a marketing director, sharp as a tack, always dressed in those high-end power suits that made her look like she owned every room she walked into. She was the fire to my ice. I adored her. I worked overtime. I took the late-night calls from construction sites. I built us a life of comfort and security. I thought I was building a home. I didn't realize I was just funding her playground. It started with the small things, the things you tell yourself are just the stress of the job. A phone placed face down on the nightstand. A sudden interest in late-night strategy sessions at the office. A scent of cologne that wasn't mine, lingering in the hallway after she got home. You want to believe. You want to be the husband who trusts his wife implicitly because that's what a good man does, right? But the engineer in me saw the cracks. I saw the way her eyes darted when I asked how her day was. I saw the way she'd flinch if I touched her shoulder unexpectedly. The structural integrity was failing, and I decided to look beneath the floorboards. I found the messages on a Tuesday. Raina had left her iPad on the kitchen counter while she went for a run. It wasn't locked. She was so confident in my goodness, a son, so sure that I was too much of a gentleman to ever snoop, that she didn't even bother with a passcode. The name on the screen was Jaxon. Jax. The messages were graphic, cruel, and laced with a level of intimacy she hadn't shown me in years. But it wasn't just the physical betrayal that gutted me. It was the way they talked about me. "He's so boring, Jax," she had typed. "He just works and nods and says, 'Yes, honey.' It's like living with a golden retriever. He'll never find out. He's too soft for that." I stood there in our kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed espresso still in the air, and I felt something in my chest turn to stone. Not break stone doesn't break easily. It settles. It becomes heavy. I didn't throw the iPad. I didn't scream. I carefully put it back exactly where it had been aligned perfectly with the edge of the granite counter. I went to the sink, washed my hands with cold water, and waited for her to come back from her run. When she walked through the door, glowing with sweat and looking more beautiful than ever, I didn't look up from my book. I let her go upstairs, take her shower, and come back down in her silk robe. Then, I dropped the bomb. I didn't lead with anger. I led with concern. I told her I'd seen a notification. I told her I was confused. And that's when the show started, the Raina special. She dropped to her knees. The tears started instantly, perfect crystalline drops. She grabbed my hands, her voice trembling. "Kellan, it was a mistake. He's nothing. I was just lonely because you've been working so much. I felt neglected, and he was just there. It was just talking, I swear. Please, please don't leave me. I can't breathe without you." I watched her perform. I noted the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear to make sure I could see the full extent of her misery. I realized she wasn't apologizing for hurting me. She was apologizing because she wasn't ready for the lifestyle I provided to end. She wanted the house, the prestige, the bank account, and she wanted Jaxon on the side. I took a deep breath, looked her straight in the eyes, and forced myself to let out a long, shaky sigh. I made my voice crack just a little bit. I don't know, Raina. This is a lot, but I love you. I want us to work. The relief that flooded her face was almost insulting. She thought she'd won. She thought the golden retriever had been successfully whistled back to his crate. She hugged me tight, sobbing into my chest, promising she would block him, promising she'd be better. I held her back, staring over her shoulder at the wall. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I went to the garage and called Porter. Porter isn't just my accountant. He's the kind of guy who knows where every dollar in the tri-state area is buried. We've been friends since we were kids. He's the only person who knows how much I actually have tucked away in private investments and family trust assets I had long before I met Raina. Porter, I said, my voice low and cold, the foundation is gone. I need to move the equity, all of it. I need a slow bleed. I want it to look like the market is hitting us hard or like I'm making bad moves. I need her to think we're struggling while I'm actually building a fortress she can't touch. Kellan? Porter's voice was steady, professional. You sure about this? Once we start moving the titles and shifting the LLCs, there's no going back. If she smells a rat during the discovery phase of a divorce, she'll come for your throat. She won't smell a rat, I replied, looking through the garage window at the sunrise. She's too busy laughing at me behind my back. She thinks I'm a coward, Porter, and I'm going to let her believe that until the very second she realizes she's standing on nothing. For the next few weeks, I became a ghost in my own life. I was the perfect, forgiving husband. I brought her flowers. I took her to dinner. I listened to her talk about her day with a patient smile. But every time I smiled, I was thinking about the bank transfer Porter had confirmed an hour earlier. Every time I kissed her forehead, I was mentally checking off another asset that had been successfully moved into a blind trust she had no legal claim to. I started leaving financial statements out on the desk, manufactured ones. I made sure she saw losses in our joint brokerage account. I started complaining about how my firm was cutting bonuses and how we might need to tighten our belts. I watched Raina's reaction carefully. At first, she was sympathetic. But as the weeks went on and she felt more secure in her control over me, the sympathy turned into a subtle, sharp-edged arrogance. She started staying out later again. She stopped bothering to hide the strategy sessions. She thought I was too broken by our financial troubles and too desperate for her love to ever challenge her again. I'd see Jaxon's name pop up on her screen while we were watching a movie. She wouldn't even tilt the phone away anymore. She'd just tap out a quick reply, smiling to herself while I sat next to her, holding a glass of wine and pretending to be engrossed in the film. "Everything okay, honey?" I'd ask, my voice the picture of naive curiosity. "Just work, Kellan," she'd say, her tone dripping with a condescension she didn't even try to hide. "Go back to your movie. You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under to keep us afloat since your bonus didn't come through." I'd nod, apologize for being a burden, and take another sip of wine. Inside, I was grinning. She was taking the bait. She was starting to see me not as a partner, but as a failing investment she needed to hedge her bets against. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but I could hear her voice coming from the upstairs balcony. She was on the phone. I stood in the entryway, my back against the wall, and listened. "I know, Jax." She was laughing, that light, airy laugh she used to reserve for me. "He's such a loser. He actually apologized to me this morning for being moody about the money. I've got him convinced we're almost broke, so he won't notice when I start moving my own commissions into that separate account we talked about. Just give me another month to make sure the house title is secure, and then I'm done. I can't wait to leave this gray sky hellhole and move to the city with you." I felt the stone in my chest get a little colder, a little harder. She wasn't just cheating. She was planning to strip me of the little she thought I had left. She was trying to outmaneuver me at my own game. But she was playing checkers and I had already cleared the board. I didn't storm upstairs. I didn't interrupt her. I walked back out the front door, waited 2 minutes, and then came back in, dropping my keys loudly on the console table. Raina, I'm home. I called out, my voice bright and empty. I heard her scramble on the balcony, the hushed, I gotta go to Jaxon, and then her footsteps on the stairs. She reached the bottom, breathless, a fake smile plastered on her face. Hey, babe, you're home early, she said, reaching out to straighten my collar. I looked at her hand, the expensive watch I'd bought her for our 5th anniversary, gleaming on her wrist. I looked at the eyes that had just been laughing at my stupidity. I had a meeting with the bank, I said, letting a touch of exhaustion seep into my voice. It's not great, Raina. I think we're going to have to sell the vacation property in Sedona. Porter says it's the only way to cover the bridge loan I took out last year. Her face went pale for a split second, not out of concern for me, but out of greed. That property was her favorite. It was where she went with her girlfriends twice a year. Sell it, she hissed, her mask slipping for a moment. Kellan, you can't be serious. That's our retreat. There has to be another way. Use your 401k or something. I can't. I lied, looking down at my shoes. I've already tapped into it. I'm sorry, Raina. I'm doing my best. She huffed a sound of pure disgust and turned her back on me to head toward the kitchen. Your best is barely keeping the lights on, Kellan. Figure it out. I'm going out for drinks with Sarah. Don't wait up. She didn't even look back as she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. She didn't see me pull my phone from my pocket and send a 3-word text to Porter. Proceed with Sedona. The truth was, the Sedona house wasn't being sold to cover a loan. It was being sold to a private entity that I controlled, and the proceeds were being funneled into a trust Raina couldn't even name in a court of law. I was liquidation the life she loved, and she was so blinded by her own arrogance that she thought I was just failing. I spent the rest of that night in my home office, the glow of the dual monitors the only light in the room. I had spreadsheets open that would make a forensic accountant weep. I was looking at the deed to our primary residence. It was currently in both our names. But I had found a clause in the original purchase agreement regarding the source of the down payment money that had come entirely from an inheritance from my grandfather. In our state, if I could prove the commingling was done under false pretenses or that I'd been coerced into the joint title, I had a fighting chance to reclaim the majority of the equity. I heard her car pull into the driveway at 2 a.m. I didn't move. I heard the front door open, her muffled laughter as she whispered into her phone, and the soft sound of her heels on the hardwood as she crept upstairs, trying to be quiet for the husband she thought was asleep. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house settle. It's funny how a building sounds when it's under stress. The wood creaks, the pipes groan. It sounds like it's trying to hold itself together, but it knows it can't. I reached out and touched the frame of a photo on my desk, a picture of us on our wedding day in Maui. We looked so happy. I looked so certain. I picked up a small, heavy brass paperweight, a gift from my father, and turned it over in my hands. It was solid, unyielding. I stood up, stretched my aching back, and walked toward the window. The streetlights were flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. I could see the silhouette of a car parked 3 houses down, a dark SUV I'd seen there before. Jaxon's car. He was watching the house, waiting for her signal, or just enjoying the view of the man he thought he was cuckolding. I didn't feel the searing pain I'd felt a month ago. I didn't feel the urge to run out there and start a fight. I just felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I wondered if he knew that the woman he was winning was currently being stripped of every asset she valued. I wondered if he'd still be there when the money was gone. I walked out of my office and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up into the darkness of the 2nd floor. I could hear the faint sound of the shower running. Raina was washing the night off her skin before she climbed into bed next to me. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a yellow legal pad from the drawer, and sat down at the breakfast nook. I picked up a pen and started a list. Not a list of grievances, not a list of why I was hurt. It was a list of every single item in this house that mattered to me. The grandfather clock, my father's books, the antique rug we'd bought in Turkey. Everything else, the furniture, the art she'd picked out, the expensive appliances, could stay. They were just objects. They were part of the facade. I heard the shower stop. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I turned the page on the legal pad and wrote one name at the top, Porter. Underneath it, I wrote the date of the following Monday. That was the day the first major transfer would be finalized. That was the day the nice guy officially died. I stood up, leaving the legal pad face down on the counter. I walked toward the stairs, my hand gripping the banister. The wood felt smooth, familiar. But as I began to climb step by step toward the room where my wife lay waiting with a heart full of lies, I didn't feel like a husband coming home. I felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of a life I'd already left behind. I reached the top of the landing and saw the light glowing from beneath our bedroom door. I paused my breath. Steady my heart, a cold rhythmic beat in the silence of the hallway. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the polished brass handle of the door, and for a split second I just stood there, listening to the muffled sound of her humming a tune I didn't recognize. I turned the handle and stepped into the room. The click of the door latch behind me sounded like the cocking of a weapon, a finality that Raina didn't even notice. She was sitting at her vanity, her back to me, meticulously dabbing expensive serum onto her neck. The air in the bedroom was thick with the scent of her jasmine perfume, a fragrance that used to make my heart skip but now only made my stomach churn. It was the smell of a cover-up. She looked at my reflection in the mirror, her eyes bright and predatory, hidden behind a mask of faux exhaustion. "You're still up," she remarked. Her voice smooth, showing no trace of the laughter I'd just heard her sharing with Jaxon moments ago. "I thought you'd be passed out after that depressing meeting with the bank." I didn't answer right away. I walked to my side of the bed and began unbuttoning my shirt, my movements slow and deliberate. I let the silence stretch, watching her through the glass. The arrogance in her posture was breathtaking. She truly believed I was a beaten dog, too broken by financial ruin to look her in the eye. I waited until the tension became palpable, until she stopped dabbing her skin and narrowed her eyes at my reflection. "I couldn't sleep," I finally said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I kept thinking about the house, about everything we've built. It feels like it's all slipping through my fingers, Raina." She turned around, the silk of her robe whispering against the chair, and gave me a look of practiced pity. "Kellan, honey, it's just property. We'll get through it. But maybe you should focus on your work instead of brooding in the dark. It's not very attractive." There it was. The sharp edge of her contempt barely veiled by a nickname. She was testing the waters of her own cruelty, seeing how much verbal abuse the golden retriever would take before he whimpered. I just nodded, climbed into bed, and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, I listened to her climb in beside me, careful not to let her skin touch mine. I lay there for hours, staring at the shadows of the tree branches dancing on the ceiling, realizing that the woman inches away from me was already mourning a man who wasn't even dead yet. She was just waiting for the body to get cold so she could collect the check. By the following Monday, the slow bleed Porter and I had engineered began to accelerate. I spent my lunch break in a cramped, nondescript office downtown, far from the prying eyes of our social circle. Porter sat across from me, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Sedona is officially under the umbrella of the trust," he whispered, tapping a finger on a signature line. "The wire transfer hit the holding account this morning. To any outside observer, including Raina's inevitable lawyers, it looks like a distressed sale to cover a debt that's tied to your firm's failed project in Vancouver." "And the joint savings?" I asked, my pen hovering over the paper. "I've started the diversion strategy," Porter explained. "Every week, small amounts are being flagged as maintenance fees or interest penalties. It's not enough to trigger an alert on her phone, but over the next month, that account is going to look like a sinking ship. She'll start seeing the balance drop and assume you're just a terrible manager of money. It'll feed her narrative that you're a loser." I signed the papers, the ink feeling like a seal on a new life. That's exactly what I want. I want her to feel the urgency to leave. If she thinks I'm broke, she'll try to grab whatever she can and run to Jaxon. I need her to be the one who initiates the split, Porter. I need her fingerprints all over the abandonment. Returning home that evening, I played the part of the defeated man to perfection. I stopped buying the nice groceries. I canceled our streaming subscriptions, claiming we needed to cut back. I watched Raina's face transition from annoyance to pure, unadulterated disgust. She hated the poor version of me even more than she hated the boring version. She started staying out until 3 or 4 a.m. She didn't even bother with the strategy session lies anymore. Sometimes she'd walk in smelling of expensive gin and a man's heavy, musky sweat, and she'd just walk right past me without a word, as if I were a piece of furniture she was planning to replace. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage pretending to organize tools when I saw Jackson's dark SUV pull up right in front of our house. He didn't even park around the corner anymore. He sat there, the engine idling music, thumping low enough to vibrate the windows. Raina walked out of the front door wearing a dress I'd bought her for our anniversary, a deep emerald silk that clung to her curves. She didn't look back at the house. She hopped into his passenger seat, leaned over and kissed him deeply right there in the open for any neighbor to see. My grip tightened on a heavy wrench. The sheer audacity of it burned. She wasn't just cheating, she was humiliating me. She was marking her territory with him, showing the world that she had already moved on from the bankrupt husband in the garage. I took a breath, forced my hands to relax, and pulled out my phone. I snapped a clear, high-resolution photo of the kiss through the garage window. I sent it to a private cloud folder labeled Evidence. "Keep going, Raina," I whispered to the empty garage. "Show me exactly who you are." That night, she didn't come home at all. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the digital clock on the microwave blink. 1 a.m., 3 a.m., 5 a.m. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a cold blue light across the kitchen, I heard the gravel crunch in the driveway. She walked in looking disheveled, but triumphant. She saw me sitting at the table and didn't even flinch. She just tossed her heels near the door and went straight to the coffee maker. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion she expected. "I stayed at Sarah's," she lied her back to me. "We had too much wine and I didn't want to drive. Not that you'd care as long as the bills are paid." "Oh, wait, you can barely do that, can you?" She turned around, a mocking smile on her lips. "You look pathetic, Kellan, sitting here in the dark like a martyr. If you spent half as much time fixing your career as you do moping about our finances, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess." I stood up, walked over to her, and looked her in the eye. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just reached out and touched a small dark bruise on her collarbone, a hickey that she hadn't bothered to cover. "I'm doing everything I can to secure our future, Raina," I said softly, the double meaning hanging in the air like a ghost. "You have no idea how hard I'm working for the end result." She shoved my hand away, her expression hardening into a sneer. "Your end result is a studio apartment and a bus pass, Kellan. I'm not going down with your ship." She stormed upstairs, and for the first time I felt a surge of genuine excitement. The bait had been taken. She was no longer just a cheating wife. She was an active participant in her own downfall. She was so convinced of her superiority that she was becoming careless. A few days later, I noticed she'd started doing her own math. I found a notepad in her purse. I wasn't being a gentleman anymore, where she had scribbled down the estimated value of our furniture, her jewelry, and the remaining balance in our joint account. She was calculating her exit fee. She had even circled the name of a high-end moving company. The brazenness of it was almost impressive. She was planning to gut the house while I was at work. She thought she could take the luxury items, the things I'd paid for, and use them to furnish a new life with Jaxon. I called Porter immediately. "She's moving faster than we thought. She's making a list. She wants to strip the house." "Let her take the furniture," Porter said, his voice calm. "It's depreciated asset anyway. The real value is in the titles and the trusts, which she can't touch." "But Kellan, you need to be careful. If she senses you're onto her, she might try to file for an emergency freeze on all accounts. We need to give her a reason to stay brazen, but distracted." "I have an idea," I said, looking at the Turkish rug in the hallway. "I'm going to give her a win. Something big enough to make her feel like she's won the war, so she stops looking at the tactical moves I'm making in the background." That evening, I came home with a bottle of champagne, the cheap kind to fit my struggling persona. I told her I'd settled a minor dispute with a contractor and had a surprise for her. I handed her an envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000. "It's not much," I said, playing the role of the hopeful husband. "But it's a start. I want you to have it. Buy yourself something nice. I know I've been a drag lately." Raina looked at the check, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and pity. She probably thought it was the last bit of marrow she could suck out of my bones. "Oh, Kellan, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she tucked the check into her silk robe. This is unexpected. Thank you. Maybe there's hope for you after all. She kissed my cheek a dry, lifeless peck and immediately headed for the stairs, probably to text Jaxon about the idiot who just gave her more moving money. I watched her go, a cold smile spreading across my face. That $10,000 wasn't a gift. It was a tracer. I documented the source of those funds, a specific personal loan that was tied to a legal clause she hadn't seen. By cashing that check and using it for her exit, she was legally acknowledging a set of financial conditions that would make my claim to the house even stronger during the final showdown. As the week progressed, the atmosphere in the house shifted from tense to predatory. Raina was like a shark circling a wounded whale. She stopped hiding her phone calls entirely. I'd walk into the room and hear her telling Jaxon about the ugly sofa she was going to leave behind and the good one she was taking. One night I woke up at 3 a.m. to find her spot in the bed empty. I walked down the hall and saw the light on in the guest room. She was in there surrounded by boxes. She was already packing. She was wrapped in her robe, a glass of wine in one hand, humming to herself as she carefully wrapped our wedding crystal in bubble wrap. She didn't hear me standing in the doorway. She was too focused on the loot. She picked up a silver picture frame, a photo of my parents, popped the back off and slid the photo out, tossing the memory onto the floor while she kept the expensive frame. I stood there, hidden by the shadows of the hallway, watching my wife dismantle our history with the efficiency of a scavenger. The pain I expected to feel didn't come. Instead, there was only a profound sense of clarity. I wasn't losing a wife. I was watching a thief reveal her true face. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the new key Porter had given me, the key to a small private storage unit where my father's books and the few things I actually valued were already safely tucked away. Raina reached for another box, her movements fluid and confident. She was so sure that tomorrow would bring her everything she wanted. She had no idea that every box she packed was another piece of evidence in the trap I was building. I turned away from the doorway and walked silently back to our bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress feeling vast and empty. I looked at the digital clock. 4:12 a.m. Tomorrow was the day I had to sign the final papers for the bridge loan settlement, the document that would officially move the primary house title into the trust. I needed her to be out of the house for at least 4 hours. I needed a distraction so grand she wouldn't even think to check the mail or look at the fine print on the insurance forms I'd asked her to sign. I leaned back against the headboard, listening to the rhythmic crinkle pop of the bubble wrap coming from the guest room. It was the sound of a woman who thought she was winning. I closed my eyes, the cold stone in my chest finally beginning to feel like a shield. The sun began to bleed through the curtains, a pale, sickly yellow light that signaled the start of the longest day of my life. I heard Raina's footsteps in the hall, the sound of her heading back to bed to catch a few hours of sleep before her big move. I lay perfectly still, my eyes closed, my breath shallow. I felt the bed dip as she climbed in, the scent of her wine and the cold air from the guest room clinging to her. She let out a long, satisfied sigh and drifted off almost instantly. I opened my eyes and stared at the door. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back now. I reached out and touched the nightstand, my fingers brushing against the heavy brass paperweight I'd moved there from my office. It was time to stop being the ghost. It was time to start being the architect of the end. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake her, and walked toward the window. Down in the street, the dark SUV was gone, but the oil stain on the asphalt where it had sat was still there, a permanent mark on our perfect neighborhood. I grabbed my phone and typed a single message to Vance, the private investigator Porter had hired to track Jaxon's own financial indiscretions. "Is the leverage ready?" The reply came back in seconds. "Ready when you are. He's deeper in debt than we thought. He needs her money as much as she thinks she needs his." I looked at the sleeping woman in the bed, her face peaceful, her lies tucked away behind closed eyelids. I felt a grim, dark sense of justice settle over me. They were two predators trying to eat each other, and I was simply the one who had built the cage. I grabbed my suit from the closet, my movements silent and sharp. I had a meeting at 8 a.m., and by the time Raina woke up to continue her theft, the world she thought she was stealing would already be gone. I walked to the door, took one last look at the room that had been my sanctuary and my prison, and stepped out into the hall, the weight of the house feeling lighter with every step I took toward the stairs. The morning air was biting a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the bedroom I had just vacated. As I descended the stairs, the silence of the house felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but the eerie stillness of a theater before the final act. I reached the bottom step and looked at the pile of boxes Raina had left in the guest room, their cardboard flaps yawning open like hungry mouths. She was so convinced she was leaving me with the scraps of a broken life, never realizing she was actually packing up the evidence of her own greed. I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the kitchen. I didn't make coffee. I didn't want the smell to linger to wake her to invite another round of her struggling wife theatrics. Instead, I stood by the island and checked my watch. 7:15 a.m. Vance had sent over a final file at dawn, a series of photographs and financial records belonging to Jaxon. It turns out, Jaxon wasn't the high-flying bachelor Raina thought he was. He was a man drowning in high-interest credit card debt and failed crypto investments looking for a life raft. And Raina, with her successful husband and perceived wealth, was his target. It's a special kind of irony, isn't it? Watching two people try to con each other while you hold the ledger for both. If you've ever seen a predator realize they're actually the prey, you know the look I was waiting for? If you're enjoying how this is unfolding, make sure to let me know in the comments. Have you ever dealt with a Jaxon in your life, someone who was all flash and no substance? I'd love to hear how you handled it. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in Thatcher's office. Thatcher was the legal muscle Porter had brought in, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and spoke in sentences that felt like binding contracts. He laid out the post-nuptial clarification agreement on the glass desk. To a casual reader, it looked like a standard insurance waiver for the bridge loan I'd lied about. But buried in the legalese of Clause 14b was a fidelity and asset disclosure requirement. If either party was found to have intentionally concealed assets or engaged in conduct that breached the marital fiduciary duty, they waived all rights to the primary residence and the trust funds. "She'll sign it," I said, my voice sounding gravelly. "She thinks I'm desperate. She thinks if she signs this, I'll get the loan and she'll have a fresh pot of money to dip into before she skips town." "And if she doesn't?" Thatcher asked, his eyebrows raised. "She will, because today I'm giving her the ultimate incentive." I left his office and headed to a local jewelry store, not a high-end boutique, but a place that sold convincing statement pieces. I bought a tennis bracelet. It was high-quality cubic zirconia set in real silver. To Raina, who measured love in carats, it would look like a five-figure peace offering. It was the bait for the signature. When I pulled back into our driveway at noon, I saw a white van parked across the street. The movers. She was actually doing it. She was moving things out while I was supposed to be at work. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. I didn't stop the car. I parked, walked inside, and found her in the living room, directing two men as they lifted our velvet sofa. She froze when she saw me. The guilt flitted across her face for a microsecond before it was replaced by that familiar, jagged armor of defiance. "Kellan, what are you doing here?" she demanded, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I thought you had meetings all day." "I did," I said, my voice trembling with a near-breakdown intensity I'd been practicing. I held up the jewelry box. "But I couldn't stop thinking about us." "Raina, I know things have been terrible. I know I've been failing you, but the bank approved the bridge loan. We're saved. I bought this to celebrate, to start over." I opened the box. The fake diamonds caught the midday sun, casting deceptive rainbows across the room. Raina's eyes widened. I saw the gears turning. She saw the bracelet, and then she saw the loan money it represented. She wasn't seeing a gift. She was seeing a bigger score. "Oh, Kellan," she breathed, her voice softening into that manipulative purr. She signaled the movers to take a break. I was just moving some of the old stuff out to make room for a fresh start. You know, clearing the energy." The lie was so bold it was almost beautiful. I didn't call her out. I leaned in and kissed her, feeling the coldness of her skin. "I need you to do one small thing for me," I whispered. "The bank needs your signature on the final insurance rider, just a formality to release the funds. Once you sign it, we can go to dinner. We can be us, again. I pulled the papers from my briefcase. I watched her read the header, Insurance and Liability Waiver. She didn't look at Clause 14b. She didn't look at the fine print about fiduciary disclosure. Her eyes were fixed on the bracelet still sitting in the open box on the counter. She grabbed a pen and scribbled her name, her signature, a jagged, hurried mess of ink. "There," she said, snapping the jewelry box shut and sliding the bracelet onto her wrist. "Now, why don't you go back to the office and finish up? I'll finish cleaning here and we can meet at 8. "Perfect," I said, tucking the signed papers back into my briefcase. "I'll see you at 8, Raina." I walked out of the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. The trap was sprung. The signature was notarized by my presence and the hidden camera I had active in the kitchen. As soon as I got into my car, I called Thatcher. "It's done. File the motion for an emergency hearing on Monday, and Thatcher send the first gift to Jaxon's inbox." The gift was a leaked document, a fake bank statement I'd created showing that Raina had just moved $200,000 into a private account. I wanted Jaxon to get greedy. I wanted him to pressure her to leave now. I needed them together in one place when the walls came down. I spent the afternoon at a park watching families play, feeling like an alien observing a species I no longer belonged to. At 6 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our home security system. The front door had been opened and stayed open for 20 minutes. The clean-out was in full swing. I drove back to the neighborhood, but I didn't go home. I parked a block away and watched. I saw Jaxon's SUV pull into the driveway. I saw him help the movers load the last of the good furniture. I saw Raina come out carrying a suitcase and a garment bag. She was laughing. She looked younger, lighter, like she'd just shed a heavy skin. They shared a celebratory drink on the front porch of the house I was still paying for. I watched through binoculars as Jaxon kissed her, his hand resting on the bracelet I'd bought for $80. They thought they were the architects of my ruin. They had no idea they were just characters in a story I had already finished writing. As they drove off, Jaxon's SUV sagging under the weight of my stolen life, I pulled into the driveway. I walked into the house. It was a skeleton. The echoes of their laughter still seemed to vibrate in the empty spaces where our furniture used to be. The velvet sofa was gone. The art was gone. Even the rugs had been rolled up. I walked into the kitchen. On the counter, she had left a note. "Kellan, I can't do this anymore. You're a good man, but you're not enough. Don't try to find me. The house is yours, what's left of it. Maybe now you can finally afford the life you want." I picked up the note and smiled. She was right about one thing. I was finally going to have the life I wanted. I went upstairs to the master bedroom. They had even taken the mattress. I didn't care. I walked to the walk-in closet and pushed aside a false panel in the back, one I had installed months ago. Inside was a small safe. I opened it and pulled out a single high-definition tablet. I sat down on the floor in the center of the empty room, the hardwood cold beneath me. I turned on the tablet and pulled up the live feed from the apartment Jaxon had rented with his crypto gains, an apartment I was currently subleasing under a shell company. I watched the screen as Raina and Jaxon walked through the door, dropping my bags and laughing. They popped a bottle of real champagne. They started talking about their future, about the idiot they'd left behind, and how much they were going to get for the furniture. "He actually gave me this," Raina laughed, flashing the bracelet. "He's so desperate for me to love him, he's literally buying my exit." To Kellan. Jaxon toasted his face, flushed with a victory that wasn't his. The man who funded our honeymoon. I watched them for a long time. I watched their greed, their smugness, their total lack of empathy. And then I opened a second app on the tablet. It was the remote access to Jaxon's laptop, which Vance had mirrored weeks ago. I pulled up a document, a legal notice of intent to sue for grand larceny and domestic asset dissipation, along with the signed post-nuptial agreement. I hovered my thumb over the send button, but I didn't press it. Not yet. I wanted them to have one night of pure, unadulterated hope. I wanted them to feel the highest high before the floor vanished. I wanted them to fall from the top of the mountain, not the base. I stood up and walked to the window. The neighborhood was dark now. A light rain had started to fall, blurring the world outside. I looked at the empty space where our life used to be, and for the first time in months, the stone in my chest felt light. It felt like air. I walked back down the stairs, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the hollow house. I went to the front door and turned the deadbolt. I wasn't locking myself in, I was locking the past out. I walked to the kitchen island, picked up the note Raina had left, and set it on fire with a small lighter. I watched the paper curl and blacken the flames reflected in the polished stone of the counter. As the last of the paper turned to ash, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had memorized. Vance, it's time. Trigger the freeze on Jaxon's accounts. All of them. And call the moving company, tell them the items they just delivered are stolen property and to expect a police escort by morning. I hung up and leaned against the counter. The silence of the empty house finally feeling like peace. I looked toward the darkened hallway, listening to the rain tap against the glass, and felt the first shiver of a cold, dark anticipation for the morning to come. The fire in the kitchen sink flickered one last time before dying into a heap of gray ash, mirroring the finality of the marriage I had just incinerated. I stood there in the shadows, the silence of the hollowed-out house wrapping around me like a tailored suit. It's strange you'd think standing in a home stripped of its warmth and its furniture would feel like a defeat. But as I watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, I felt more like a man who had finally cleared the weeds from a garden he intended to replant. The walls were bare, the floors were empty, and for the first time in 7 years, I could finally see the true dimensions of the room. Before I tell you how the sun rose on the wreckage of their new beginning, I want to ask you a question that's been on my mind all night. Do you believe that true justice has to be loud? Or is there a deeper satisfaction in a revenge so quiet that the person doesn't even know they've lost until the handcuffs click or the lights go out? Let me know in the comments if you think I pushed Raina too far, or if she earned every bit of the silence I'm about to give her. And if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's the only way to ensure you don't miss the next time a nice guy decides he's had enough. The morning of the final move arrived with a pale, unforgiving light. I didn't sleep in that empty house. I spent the night in a hotel room 2 blocks away from Jaxon's apartment, watching the digital feed on my tablet. At 8 a.m. sharp, the world Raina had stolen began to dissolve. I watched through the subleased apartment's security camera as Raina stood in the kitchen, still in her silk robe, trying to brew coffee in a machine that Jaxon hadn't paid the utility bill for. She kept flipping the switch, her brow furrowing in that familiar look of annoyed entitlement. She didn't know that Vance had already executed the freeze on Jaxon's primary accounts. She didn't know that the bridge loan she thought she'd signed for was actually a legal trapdoor. Then came the knock on the door. Not a gentle one. When Jaxon opened it, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor, he was met by Porter Thatcher and 2 uniformed officers. I watched his face drain of all that bronze, arrogant color. Raina rushed to the door, her hand instinctively clutching the fake tennis bracelet on her wrist, the one she thought was her golden ticket. "Jaxon! What is this?" she shrieked, her voice hitting that high, desperate note I'd heard 1,000 times during her apologies. Thatcher didn't waste time. He stepped into the foyer, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "Ms. Raina, I'm here on behalf of Kellan. We're here to recover stolen property, specifically the furniture and household assets removed from the residence yesterday. Since you signed the post-nuptial disclosure yesterday, acknowledging that these items were marital assets subject to fiduciary protection, your removal of them constitutes grand larceny." Raina's jaw dropped. She looked at the officers, then at the movers who were already starting to carry our velvet sofa back out of the apartment. But Kellan gave me a check. He forgave me. He said we were starting over. "The check was a loan for a business entity that doesn't exist," Porter added, checking a tablet. "And the signature you provided on the insurance writer, it was an admission of guilt. You acknowledged in writing that you were aware of the financial constraints and that any dissipation of assets would result in a total forfeiture of your claim to the house and the trusts." I watched Jaxon try to intervene, his voice stuttering about his rights. The officers didn't care. They were there to keep the peace while the moving company, now working for me, repossessed every single item they had delivered the night before. But the real blow came when Jaxon turned to Raina, his eyes darting toward the suitcase full of her money. "Raina just used the $200,000 from the private account. Pay them off, let's just get out of here." Raina looked at him confused. "What 200,000? I don't have that, Jaxon." I thought you were the one with the money. The silence that followed was the most honest moment of their entire relationship. In that one look, they both realized they had been conned not just by me, but by each other. Jaxon realized Raina wasn't the wealthy escape hatch he needed, and Raina realized Jaxon was just a broke predator looking for a meal. The private account statement I'd leaked to Jaxon was the bait that had lured him into showing his true face to her, and her lack of funds was the reality that would now bury him. By noon, Jaxon's apartment was as empty as my house had been. Raina sat on a single suitcase in the middle of the room, the fake diamonds on her wrist, dull in the harsh daylight. She tried to call me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear her cry. I didn't need to hear her tell me how sorry was or how Jaxon had tricked her. The loop was broken. I walked into the law firm an hour later to finalize the divorce filing. Thatcher met me at the door with a grim smile. She's got nothing, Kellan. Between the larceny charges we're holding over her head and the post-nup, she'll be lucky to walk away with the clothes on her back. Jaxon is already being investigated for wire fraud based on the crypto documents Vance pulled. They're going to be too busy fighting each other in court to ever bother you again. I sat down and signed the final page. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the fiery, explosive joy I'd imagined. It was deeper. It was the feeling of a structure finally being leveled so that something new could be built on the land. "What's next for you?" Porter asked as we walked out into the Seattle rain. "I'm selling the house," I said, looking up at the gray sky. "The trust already owns the equity. I'm going to take a year, maybe go to Sedona, the real house, the one she thinks is sold. I want to build something that isn't for anyone else, just for me." As I drove past our old neighborhood one last time, I saw a "for sale" sign being hammered into the lawn of the Craftsman house. I didn't stop. I didn't look back at the windows where I'd spent 7 years trying to be a good man for a woman who didn't exist. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a foundation that's failing is to let it collapse. You can't fix a heart that's built on lies, and you can't save a person who only sees you as an ATM. Kindness is a gift, but it's not a blank check. And the moment someone mistakes your patience for weakness is the moment they lose the right to your grace. I pulled onto the highway, the city receding in my rearview mirror. The rain was washing the dust off my windshield, clearing the path ahead. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the heavy brass paperweight. I felt its weight, its solidity, its truth. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the man who survived. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a decade, I was the one behind the wheel, and I knew exactly where I was going. I rolled down the window, letting the cold, fresh air fill the car, and for the first time, I didn't think about the math. I didn't think about the cost. I just drove,